So you want to know more about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints' attempts to publish its own history. My name is Benjamin Park. I'm a scholar of American history and a specialist in Mormon studies. I've written a number of books on Mormon history, including Kingdom of Nauvoo and American Zion, A New History of Mormonism. I am often fascinated when studying the Mormon past at the institution's own attempt to try to write its history, to reconcile the historical record with its truth claims. Now, I could talk about a number of attempts over the 200-year history, including the most recent attempt, the 4-volume Saints series, which has received a lot of acclaim and some respect from the academic community. But I want to talk about a previous attempt. Back in the 1970s, when the church envisioned a 16-volume project that would be published as part of its Sesquicentennial celebration in 1980. So let's talk about the rise and fall of the Sesquicentennial History Series. In early 1972, LDS leaders appointed Leonard J. Arrington to be the church historian. Arrington was the first person with a PhD in history with actual academic chops to be appointed to that position. It was part of a professionalization kick taking place in the LDS Church, where they had hired a consulting firm in previous years to learn how they can be more efficient as a global corporation. And one of the things that the consulting firm told them is you need to empower and trust experts over your different divisions. So they created the history division and they appointed an academic, Leonard Arrington, in charge. Now, Leonard Arrington was an obvious choice. He was a professional historian and often seen as the dean of what was called New Mormon history, a scholarly movement to analyze Mormonism according to academic standards. I've actually done a video in the past on this historical moment that you might want to go back and see, and the politics of writing Mormon history. And Arrington, once he was in charge, he had several goals that he wanted the historical division to accomplish. He wanted to produce a series of articles on a variety of topics, which they accomplished. He wanted to help facilitate better access to archives so that all scholars can dig into those sources, which in large part they succeeded. They also wanted to produce new 1-volume histories of the church, one directed to the Latter-day Saints, which would become Story of the Latter-day Saints, more on that later, and one directed to a general audience known as Mormonism, the Mormon experience. Maybe I'll talk about that in a future video. And then perhaps the most ambitious goal, which was supposed to represent this new era of coming to grips with the Mormon past. He envisioned a multi-volume series authored by different historians discussing different eras and topics in Mormon history that would be published simultaneous with the church's sesquicentennial celebration in 1980, when they would celebrate the 150th anniversary of the faith's founding. The project had actually been initially proposed to Arrington by Richard Bushman, who was at that time probably the most successful historian who came out of the Mormon tradition. He had won the Bancroft Prize for his impressive book on early colonial American history, but he remained committed to the LDS community. And in fact, Leonard Arrington continued a hope to try to draw Bushman away from academia on the East Coast back to Salt Lake City with hopes to make him the assistant church historian. That never happened. But in Arrington's vision, he wanted to have 15 volumes, each authored by different LDS historians that covered either a specific moment of time, a period, or a specific theme. And he wanted these books to cover all facets of the faith, from the founding in 1830 all the way to 1980. And importantly, he wanted the histories to place Mormonism within the context of the wider world. They would grant these authors a degree of freedom to write what they felt was best. They would provide them in advance, and then they would eventually be reviewed by the church historians and be published by Deseret Book with a special imprint created for this series. And remarkably, church authorities signed off on all of Leonard Arrington's plans, including on the Sesquicentennial history. In fact, they said they did so because they trusted not just Arrington, but a lot of the historians he proposed. Notably, they singled out Richard Bushman as, if you get a lot of historians who can write like Richard Bushman, this will be great. Keep that quote in mind as we get later on in the video. The only dispute seemed to be about money. There was a concern that especially if these volumes get adopted into church curriculum, they didn't want these authors to get rich off of, church-sponsored material, which of course there's an irony given a lot of church leaders get their own royalties from Deseret Book products. But this resulted in one of my favorite anecdotes of Leonard Arrington sitting before the First Presidency and N. Eldon Tanner, who was a counselor in the First Presidency, saying, well, you have to understand our concern. We don't want these historians to be getting rich every year if we are promoting their book. So for instance, your book, Great Basin Kingdom, that's the book that Leonard Arrington wrote, one of the best books in Mormon history. Your book, Great Basin Kingdom, you probably make a lot of money off of that, right? And Leonard Arrington responded, yeah, about $300. And Tanner goes, okay, that's not as much as I thought, but if you're making $300 every year, that adds up. And Arrington responds, no, $300 total. To which Tanner kind of looks at him awkwardly and goes, okay, never mind. There's probably not a problem here. Just as a quick side note, if you enjoy these types of histories, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Every Friday, I try to do videos that pull the curtain back on the historical profession, give you some insights on how history operates, and some recommendations of great books that I recommend and articles, which we'll get to later in this video. All right, let's get back to the Sesquicentennial history. So while the project would evolve in the following few years, by the end of summer of 1972, Arrington had a clear and formalized proposal for this project. He was going to serve as a series editor along with his two assistant church historians, Jim Allen and Davis Bitton. Here's a picture of the three of them rocking what I would just call the quintessential 1970s outlook for suit coats. Just phenomenal work. Anyways, here are the volumes as originally envisioned in 1972. First, there was going to be a volume on the origins of the church up until 1830, which they wanted Richard Anderson, a BYU professor, to write. Richard Anderson eventually begs off, and so they approach Richard Bushman to do that. Second, they were going to have a book on Ohio by Milton Bachman, a BYU professor. Third, they were going to have a book on Missouri by Robert Matthews, also a BYU professor. Then they'll move into Illinois and have T. Edgar Lyons, a teacher in the Seminaries and Institute program. Then a book on Crossing the Plains by Reed Durham, also in Seminaries and Institute. And then 2 volumes on the Pioneer period, one the earlier period by Eugene Campbell, a BYU professor, and the second, the later Pioneer period by Charles Peterson at Utah State University. On the early 20th century, 1900 and 1930, they wanted Thomas Alexander, a BYU professor. Then the church from 1930 to 1950, John Sorensen. And from 1950 to 1980, Jim Allen, all of them at BYU. Then they wanted to look globally, and they were going to have an LDS Church in Europe volume produced by Douglas Tobler, who taught German history at BYU. And then a book on Mexico and Central and South America by Lamont Tullis, also at, you guessed it, BYU. And then they wanted a book on the Far East and Oceania, which Lanier Britch, who would eventually split that volume into 2. And then finally a book on the missionary program that they approached George Ellsworth of Utah State University. And then to round it out, they wanted a book that looks at Mormonism from a cultural and social perspective, which they assigned to Davis Bitton, the assistant church historian, who was also a professor at the University of Utah. Just a few thoughts on the vision of this project. First, I think it demonstrated a real commitment from the church that previously had been quite shy of sponsoring academic history of the faith, now willing to sign contracts with these 15 real academic scholars to do work. Now, there's probably a question of how much freedom they actually would have given them, but I think it did show a degree of commitment. I also appreciate the series gave attention to international issues, and especially that the church promised access to sources that historians previously were not able to get access to. This was an excuse that Arrington was able to use to open the archives. We need to allow these scholars to gain access in order to write the histories. And the church even promised to use them for curriculum going forward. I think it's also fair to highlight some of the shortcomings of the series. Notably, and you probably picked this up, there was not a single woman envisioned among the authors, nor was women highlighted as a key theme for the volumes, which is just a sad testament to the time. And it's not like there weren't women historians who could have done it. Juanita Brooks was still around, and Leonard Arrington had a really weird relationship to Juanita Brooks. And he even employed several really great women historians in the history division, and they weren't assigned volumes either. Now, once they got that formal proposal approved, they pushed forward. Bushman subbed in for Richard Anderson. It soon grew to 16 volumes because Lanier Brish wanted to do both one on the Far East and one on the Oceania. They finally settled the dispute over royalties versus flat fees, and eventually there was a formal dinner in November 1973 where all the authors were invited in, where Thomas Monson spoke, and it seemed to represent a firm commitment from the church into this ambitious project. And then, as you might imagine, the storms rolled in. Problems with Leonard Arrington's history division started almost immediately. By the end of his first year, he was already recording in his voluminous and very gossipy diaries the conflicts that he was having with church authorities, because not everyone was on board with this general open scholarly approach that the Sesquicentennial History Series signified. Most notably, apostles Boyd K. Packer and Ezra Taft Benson were really upset with these academic histories that they believed took out God and divinity out of the story. There were some early tussles over the historical division's publications on the Word of Wisdom and on the First Presidency, but the real fight came in 1976 with the publication of James Allen and Glenn Leonard's The Story of the Latter-day Saints. Remember, this was going to be the one-volume history that the church would adopt, and it was meant to replace Joseph Fielding Smith's 50-year-old Essentials in Church History, which is really just hagiography and devotional history. Story of the Latter-day Saints, I'd argue, is still one of the best social histories the church has ever produced, and I used it a lot when I wrote my book, American Zion. But Benson and Packer and Mark Peterson, another apostle, hated it. They believed it was too naturalistic. It was too secular. It took the divinity out of history. It didn't play up enough the faithfulness, that it emphasized the historical conditions for things like the Word of Wisdom. And so this resulted in a fateful meeting where Leonard Arrington met with the First Presidency and the opposing apostles in the autumn of 1976, and for over 2 hours, it nearly came to a shouting match over the direction of history. And even though Arrington left that meeting, and Spencer W. Kimball, the prophet at the time, told him, "We still got your back, and we're still moving with the Sesquicentennial history," their days were numbered. Rumors started creeping out that Benson and Packer wanted to kill the Sesquicentennial history, and Arrington had to continually assure the authors, no, we're still moving forward. Eventually, in March of 1978, Gordon B. Hinckley, who, though still just an apostle, was already kind of becoming the authority at the church headquarters, he starts exploring options of how can we cancel the contracts with all these different authors. And it would have been canceled if it weren't for the legal team saying, actually, we've already signed a contract with them. We have to go forward with fruition. And the church decided, all right, we'll just go forward. So Leonard Arrington was like, phew, we survived. And so the project survived for another 2 years. They eventually get 4 of those manuscripts turned in. This is going to shock you to hear, but historians are not always punctual in turning in their book manuscripts. And so by 1980, they have 4 manuscripts. Most of them fly through review without much of a problem, except for one, Richard Bushman's book on the origins of Mormonism, which apparently caused some concern among the church authorities. Because one of the things that happened after that 1976 meeting is now they instituted an ecclesiastical review process where several apostles had to review any products from the church history division. It was not just the church history division like Leonard Arrington reviewing anymore like originally agreed. And so those volumes remained in limbo until 1980, a couple of years later, when Arrington was told that the church was going to get out of those contracts by just buying off the authors, paying them all the money they could have promised and letting them take their manuscripts for to do whatever they wanted. And in fact, Arrington's own division was closed down at the church history department and moved down to BYU, which Arrington saw as a demotion, and he was crushed because he saw this as the end of this bright moment of historical awareness at church headquarters. Fortunately, over half of those commissioned volumes eventually were published, though many of them outside of the church. And we got some of our most important contributions in Mormon historiography out of this series. For instance, Richard Bushman transformed his early volume into Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, published by University of Illinois Press. Those chapters, by the way, end up being repurposed as the first few chapters in his Rough Stone Rolling biography. We also get Milton Bachman's book, The Heavens Resound, A History of the Latter-day Saints in Ohio. We get Glenn Leonard's Nauvoo, A Place of Peace, A People of Promise. He took over that project from T. Edgar Lyon. Eugene Campbell published Establishing Zion, the Mormon Church in the American West. That was published by Signature Books. Thomas Alexander published one of the most monumental books in the Mormon field, Mormonism in Transition. It appeared with University of Illinois Press, has recently been reissued in a new edition from Cofford Press. Richard Cohen published The Church in the 20th Century. Lanier Brish published his 2 volumes he worked on, Upon the Isles of the Sea and From the East. And then Lamont Tullis published his volume, Mormons in Mexico. So we still got some of those books that were commissioned in those Sesquicentennial series, but they did not appear with that imprint, and they did not appear as part of that group, which was supposed to signify the church's embrace of its history for its 150th anniversary. I think this story is fascinating, not just for the backstory on some of the most important books in the Mormon history field, but it's just one episode in this larger struggle of the LDS institution coming to grips with its history. Leonard Arrington's vision lost. His Camelot, as they came to call it, came to a close, and it wasn't until several decades later that it was revived in a new form. The more recent church history division that has produced the Joseph Smith Papers Project and Saints has been able to have a better relationship with church authorities for reasons that maybe I'll get into in a future video. And the Saints volumes, in many ways, is a successor to the Sesquicentennial series, but it's also very different. They don't grant an individual author so much latitude. It's work by committee. And further, all those volumes are often working in tandem with church leadership, which on the one hand means it's, fits into church curriculum. On the other, it means they're actually able to be published. And so I think the Saints volumes, there's a lot of similarities, but also a lot of differences that show how the history division has learned to operate within those ecclesiastical demands. Maybe I'll do a video in the future on the Saints volumes, because I think it's both really good history within an institutional devotional context, but also tells us a lot about how the church is currently viewing its past. If you're interested in the story of the Sesquicentennial history, I have a few resources for you. First, Gary Bergere published with Signature Books and the Smith Pettit Foundation an edition of Leonard Arrington's diaries. These are phenomenal sources, one of the most important records we have to understand not just historical scholarship, but church office building culture in the 1970s. And we also have a wonderful biography of Leonard Arrington by Greg Prince, Leonard Arrington and the Writing of Mormon History, published by the University of Utah Press. I recommend both if you want to dig into this topic more. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to like it and share it with others. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. I hope, if you can't tell yet, that history is relevant. It means something. It gives us context for this day, which is why these conversations, these fascinating episodes, are so important to dig into and discuss.